Hello, and welcome to Read Aloud with me, Dan. Today on Read Aloud, we'll be reading Section 5 of On Contradiction. Section 5, the identity and struggle of the aspects of a contradiction. In the previous section, we discussed how in each contradiction, which is basically a type of oppositional relationship, there are always two sides or aspects. That's with the possible exception of AI wives and husbands. This section of the text, section 5, refers to the element of the interdependence or mutual dependence of both aspects or opposing forces of a contradiction, and how, in given conditions, those aspects transform into one another. This is about how the two sides come together in conflict and their unity, I think is maybe a better word. So when the title of this chapter says, the identity and struggle of the aspects of a contradiction, it doesn't, for me, it doesn't immediately make sense. Like, what the hell are you talking about? And it's this unity, this struggle, the coming together of the different aspects of the contradiction and their struggle. That's what we're talking about here. And how in some times, if the conditions are right, those aspects of the contradiction that are struggling with each other switch places. Let's read. When we understand the universality and the particularity of contradiction, which we discussed in previous sections, make sure you go back and read those if you haven't, we must proceed to study the problem of the identity and struggle of the aspects of a contradiction. And when I say go back and read, I'm not trying to be bossy. I'm just saying that, like, we're building knowledge, and this builds off previous chapters. This builds off previous sections. This will not make sense fully if you have not read previous sections. And those previous sections won't make sense unless you've read the works that I suggested that you read before those. But let's read on. So, identity. What are we talking about here? He says identity, unity, coincidence, interpenetration, wink, interpermeation, interdependence or mutual dependence for existence, interconnection or mutual cooperation. All these different terms mean the same thing and refer to the following 2 points. First, the existence of each of the 2 aspects of a contradiction in the process of the development of a thing presupposes the existence of the other aspect, and both aspects coexist in a single entity. The second meaning is, in given conditions, each of the 2 contradictory aspects transforms itself into its opposite. This is the meaning of identity. Okay, so for those of you who have been reading up until now, these previous sections, is this so far making some sense? Or are you completely lost? If you're completely lost, try to ask a question so we can get to the heart of your maybe misunderstanding or whatever. Reading on, he says, Lenin said, dialectics is the teaching which shows how opposites can be and how they happen to be, or how they become identical. Identical. And under what conditions they are identical, transforming themselves into one another. Why the human mind should take these opposites not as dead, rigid, but as living, conditional, mobile, transforming themselves into one another. What does this passage mean? The contradictory aspects in every process exclude each other, struggle with each other, and are in opposition to each other. Without exception, they are contained in the process of development of all things, all real things, and in all human thought. A simple process contains only a single pair of opposites, while a complex process contains more. And in turn, the pairs of opposites are in contradiction to one another. That is how all things in the objective world and all human thought are constituted, and how they are set in motion. This being so, there is an utter lack of identity or unity. How then can one speak of identity or unity? The fact is that no contradictory aspect can exist in isolation. Without its opposite aspect, each loses the condition for its existence. Just think, can any one contradictory aspect of a thing or of a concept in the human mind exist independently? Without life, there would be no death. Without death, there would be no life. Without above, there would be no below. And without below, no above. Without misfortune, there would be no good fortune. Without good fortune, no misfortune. Without facility, there'd be no difficulty. Without difficulty, no facility. Without landlords, there would be no tenant peasants. Without tenant peasants, there would be no landlords. Without the bourgeoisie, now we're talking, there would be no proletariat. Without the proletariat, there would be no bourgeoisie. Without imperialist oppression of nations, there would be no colonies or semi-colonies. Without semi-colonies or colonies, no imperialist oppression of nations. It is so with all opposites, real opposites. In given conditions, on the one hand, they are opposed to each other, and on the other, they are interconnected, interpenetrating, and interpermeating, and interdependent. And this character is described as identity. Does a magnet work with this? Can you think in certain conditions, magnets attract and sometimes they repel? He says, in given conditions, all contradictory aspects possess the character of non-identity and hence are described as being in contradiction. They also possess the character of identity and hence are interconnected. This is what Lenin means when he says that dialectics studies how opposites can be identical. But how can they be identical? Because each is the condition for the other's existence. This is the first meaning of identity. Heady stuff, right? So I'm going to refer here to the curriculum of the Basic Principles of Marxism-Leninism, Part 1, The Worldview and Philosophical Methodology of Marxism-Leninism. I'm going to jump to annotation 184, which says, all forms of contradiction drive motion and development. These processes exist in unity and opposition. For example, in political economics, production is driven by consumption, and consumption is facilitated by production. Even though these are fundamentally opposite forces, production adds to the total quantity of products, while consumption reduces the total quantity of products. They can't exist without one another, and they drive each other forward. This is the dialectical nature of contradiction as the driving force of all motion and development as defined in materialist dialectics. So we're explaining here that identity and unity are more or less the same concept when it comes to understanding the nature of contradiction between opposites. In material processes of nature, social processes, and processes of consciousness, we perceive and define oppositional forces by recognizing mutually exclusive and contradictory tendencies within and between things, phenomena, and ideas. In other words, whenever we think of an oppositional relationship, we define it in terms of the opposition. When we think of a war, we think of the contradictions which exist between the opposing nations. When we think of a disease, we define it by the oppositional forces between the ailment and the human body. When we think of an economy, we think of the oppositional forces of production and consumption within the economy. In other words, the identity of contradictory relationships is defined by the unity of the opposing sides with one another. Okay, how about a boxing match? Two guys or two people might hate each other's guts, and they get in the match and they get in the ring, they smash each other's faces. But they're not smashing each other's faces because they hate each other's guts. That's not the primary contradiction. They're doing it for other reasons, money, right? Does that analogy work? So the process of unity and struggle of opposites inevitably leads to a transformation between them, in given conditions. If these, opposing forces are not bumping into one another, then they're not going to transform each other. In those given conditions, they don't change each other. But if contradictory forces are bumping into each other, generally speaking, that is what can help lead to them changing themselves and changing each other. The transformation between opposites takes place with rich diversity, and such transformations can vary depending on the properties of the opposite sides, as well as specific material conditions. Opposing sides, by definition, oppose one another. If forces or characteristics which exist within or between things, phenomena, or ideas do not oppose one another, then they are not, by definition, opposites. Thus, it can be understood that opposing sides have a tendency to struggle against one another. It is this very struggle which defines two sides as opposites and as contradictory. And now we can read on. But it is enough to say merely that each of the contradictory aspects is a condition for the other's existence, that there is identity between them, and that consequently they can coexist in a single identity, a single entity, he says. No, it's not enough to say that. The matter does not end with their dependence on each other for their existence. What is more important is their transformation into each other. And again, we're talking about transformation of aspects into each other, not transformation of people, So the bourgeoisie will not Okay, let me put it this way. The proletariat will not transform into the bourgeoisie and move into the penthouses and run the stock exchange and own the stocks and do the trading. That's not, and then the bourgeoisie becomes proletariat or lumpenprolet. No, that's not what we mean. The aspects of their relationship will change. What aspect are we talking about? Well, power. The bourgeoisie will no longer have power, and the proletariat will have power over the bourgeoisie until the bourgeoisie stops existing as a class. Until classes don't exist. And then we can get rid of the state once and for all. I mean, after all, it's not really doing great. All right. Let's keep reading, I guess. He says the matter doesn't end with their dependence. What's more to say is they transform into each other. So he goes, why is their identity here, too, the second meaning? When it changes its position to that of its opposite, why is their identity here, too, he asks. He says, you see, by means of revolution, the proletariat, at one time the ruled, is transformed into the ruler, while the bourgeoisie, the erstwhile ruler, is transformed into the ruled and changes its position to that originally occupied by its opposite. It doesn't mean the proletariat becomes bourgeois. He says this has already taken place in the Soviet Union, as it will take place throughout the world. Communism will win. If there were no interconnection and identity of opposites in given conditions, how could such a change take place? The Kuomintang, which played a certain positive role at a certain stage in modern Chinese history, became a counter-revolutionary party after 1927 because of its inherent class nature and because of imperialist blandishments, these being the conditions. But it has been compelled to agree to resist Japan because of the sharpening of the contradiction between China and Japan, and because of the Communist Party's policy of the United Front. These being the conditions. Sorry. Things in contradiction change into one another, and herein lies a definite identity. Really? All right, never mind. So, things in contradiction change into one another in given conditions, right? So, that is a definite unity. That is a definite kind of a identity, a kind of unity. Yeah. Reading on, it says, our agrarian revolution has been a process in which the landlord class owning the land is transformed into a class that has lost its land. Get wrecked, dummies. While the peasants who once lost their land are transformed into small holders who have acquired land. And it will be such a process once again. Now, does that mean the landlord class is just like thrown in prisons and stuff? Are they all sent to the gulags? No. They're transformed into peasants who are small holders of land. In given conditions, having and not having, acquiring and losing are interconnected. There's identity of the two sides. Under socialism, private peasant ownership is transformed into the public ownership of socialist agriculture. So those private owners lose their class status and they become part of the masses. Part of the masses that have public ownership. So yeah, they've lost their land, but now they're part of the public ownership. Is that tracking? We don't necessarily have to murder all the landlords. We just have to change their relationship to ownership of private property. If they want to fight us over it, I think some of them will have to die. He says there is a bridge leading from private property to public property, which in philosophy is called identity or transformation into each other or interpenetration. Wink. Okay. So again, my most unhinged theory is that revolution theoretically doesn't have to be violent. It's only made violent by the owning and ruling classes refusing to give up power non-violently. However, theoretically, it doesn't have to be violent. It's just that they choose violence every time. So I know that. However, again, theoretically, revolution doesn't have to be violent. All we have to do is just change our relationship to things. That doesn't require violence. It's just that the people in power don't want to lose their power. So, of course, they're going to use their power, including violence, to maintain their power. This is not confusing. Of course, the class of people willing to exploit the masses so they can afford their extremely lavish lifestyles that they have even too much money to spend, of course they're going to use violence on us if we try to take away their power. Of course they would. They're fucking freaks. So again, theoretically, all we have to do is change our relationship to things, which doesn't require violence. But I understand in reality it will. That's just how it works. That's how the world works. I wish it wasn't the case. I really do. Like, I'm not a sick fuck. I don't want to. I don't want to go do violence. I like reading and sitting and smoking weed. Like, I don't want to do violence. But I understand that that's what it'll take. Sucks. I hate this world. But I didn't make it this way. It's not my fault. Reading on. To consolidate the dictatorship of the proletariat, or the dictatorship of the people, is in fact to prepare the conditions for abolishing this dictatorship and advancing to the higher stage when all state systems are eliminated. And this, if you're an anarchist, you just hate what I just said, but I don't know, you need to pick up a book. He says, to establish and build the Communist Party is in fact to prepare the conditions for the elimination of the Communist Party and all political parties. You just hear what he said? In a sense, the goal is no Communist Party. But guess what? The pathway to that, the pathway to get rid of the state, is through the Communist Party. So it's not like we all want to have a Communist Party because it's just, we think it's cool or something. It's because we fucking care about abolishing the state and about abolishing dictatorship in general. The pathway to abolishing dictatorship is through dictatorship. And that doesn't make sense if you're a baby. But some people can't be helped. To build a revolutionary army, he says, under the leadership of the Communist Party and to carry on revolutionary war is in fact to prepare the conditions for the permanent elimination of war. That's right, you guys. If you want to eliminate war, you're going to have to engage in war. That might not make sense, but some people are babies, and they can't be helped. He says these opposites are at the same time complementary. War and peace, as everybody knows, transform themselves into each other. War is transformed into peace. For example, the First World War was transformed into a post-war peace. The white man's word. Was it really peace? Was it really peaceful? No, it was relatively peaceful. He says it transformed into post-war peace, and the civil war in China has now stopped, giving place to internal peace. Does peace mean without contradictions? Does peace mean without tensions? No, it does not. In fact, peace often does not even mean the presence of justice. What kind of peace is that? Rather have a piece of pizza. He says peace is transformed into war. For instance, the Kuomintang communist cooperation was transformed into war in 1927. And today's situation of world peace may be transformed into a second world war. Oh no. This is like it's like looking at media from like September 10th, 2001, right? And they're like, one day a plane might fly into the Twin Towers. He says it may be transformed into a second world war. Why is this so? Because in class society, such contradictory things as war and peace have an identity in given contradictions. Someone's whispering in Mao's ear, a second world war has hit the Twin Towers. All contradictory things are interconnected. Not only do they coexist in a single entity in given conditions, but in other given conditions, they also transform themselves into each other. This is the full meaning of the identity of opposites. This is what Lenin meant when he discussed how they happen to be, or how they become identical, under what conditions they are identical, transforming themselves into one another. And that's it. That's what life is. That's what reality is, you guys. It's just a bunch of contradictory things in forward motion through time that are being changed by themselves and are bumping into each other, and in given conditions they change each other, and then they change into each other. Their aspects, their contradictory aspects. This is all it is. That's the universe. That's time itself. That's the history of the universe. And you're in this stream of consciousness. Of contradictions, and you're just like on an inner tube riding this stream of contradictions as you yourself change via your own internal contradictions, developing and bumping into themselves and changing themselves and changing each other and transforming into each other. And then you out there in the world with your ball of contradictions bound up inside yourself, bumping into others. It's just wild, isn't it? That's all it is. That's all it is. He says, why is it that the human mind should take these opposites not as dead, rigid, but as living, conditional, mobile, transforming themselves into one another? Why is it? Because that is just how things are in objective reality. Why? Well, it's just because it's real, okay? That's what he says. Oh, man. He says the fact is that the unity or identity of opposites in objective things is not dead or rigid, but is living, conditional, mobile, temporary, and relative. In given conditions, every contradictory aspect transforms itself into its opposite. Reflected in man's thinking, this becomes the Marxist world outlook of materialist dialectics. It is only the reactionary ruling classes of the past and present, and the metaphysicians in their service, who regard opposites not as living, conditional, mobile, and transforming themselves into one another, but as dead and rigid. And they propagate this fallacy everywhere to delude the masses of the people, thus seeking to perpetuate their rule. When you hear bad arguments, when I hear bad arguments, all I hear is, I'm doing apologetics for the ruling class. And it makes me really mad. I don't know about you guys. I'm like, you're realizing you're doing their job for them. The people who are oppressing you and me and all your friends and family. Why are you doing their fucking job? Will you just, you know what I mean? It makes me really mad. So he says the task of communists is to expose the fallacies of the reactionaries and the metaphysicians, to propagate the dialectics inherent in things, and so accelerate the transformation of things and achieve the goal of revolution. In speaking of the identity of opposites in given conditions, what we're referring to is real and concrete opposites and the real and concrete transformations of opposites into one another. We're not talking about comic books here. You cannot analyze the Bible this way, which is just a comic book for a different time. He says, in speaking of the identity of opposites in given conditions, what we're referring to is real and concrete opposites. There are innumerable transformations in mythology. For instance, Quafu's race with the sun in Shan Hai Jing, Yi's shooting down of 9 suns in Huai Nanzi, or the Monkey's King's 72 metamorphoses in Shi Yuji. The numerous episodes of ghosts and foxes metamorphosed into human beings in the strange tales of Liao Shai, etc. Marvel, The Matrix, it's all fake, you guys. These legendary transformations of opposites are not concrete changes reflecting concrete contradictions. It's made up. They're naive, imaginary, subjectively conceived transformations conjured up in men's minds by innumerable real and complex transformations of opposites into one another. As Marx said, all mythology masters and dominates and shapes the forces of nature in and through the imagination. Hence, it disappears as soon as man gains mastery over the forces of nature. Yeah. The myriads of changes in mythology, and also in nursery tales, delight people because they imaginatively picture man's conquest of the forces of nature, and the best myths possess eternal charm, as Marx put it. But myths are not built out of concrete contradictions existing in given conditions, and therefore are not a scientific reflection of reality. That is to say, in myths or nursery tales, the aspects constituting a contradiction have only an imaginary identity, not a concrete identity. The scientific reflection of the identity in real transformations is materialist dialectics. He asks, why can an egg, but not a stone, be transformed into a chicken? Why is there identity between war and peace, but none between war and a stone? Why can human beings give birth only to human beings and not to anything else? Well, that's not true. You could give birth to a Zionist. But I'm just being nitpicky here. He says the sole reason is that the identity of opposites exists only in necessary given conditions. Without these necessary given conditions, there can be no identity whatsoever. There's no conflict inherent between a war and a stone. It does what? Doesn't make sense. Why is it that in Russia in 1917, the bourgeois democratic February Revolution was directly linked with the proletarian socialist October Revolution, while in France, the bourgeois revolution was not directly linked with the socialist revolution, and the Paris Commune of 1871 ended in failure? It's because you're comparing an egg and a stone. One of these things has the conditions that will lead to the birth of a thing, and one of them's a stone, which doesn't have the things inside of it that'll give birth to a revolution or a chicken. Got it? Comparing apples and oranges here. He says, why is it, on the other hand, that the nomadic system of Mongolia and Central Asia has been directly linked with socialism? Why is it that the Chinese Revolution can avoid a capitalist future and be directly linked with socialism without taking the old historical road of Western countries, without passing through a period of bourgeois dictatorship? And a lot of trots and so-called Maoists would get very mad at this. They would be like, well, actually, see, he was wrong. They're actually doing it. You know, they think that China is somehow capitalist because there's elements of capitalism, despite the fact that there's no bourgeois dictatorship. They would argue there is, but there's clearly no bourgeois dictatorship. Well, if that's the case, why do they prosecute the bourgeois? If the bourgeois controls the state, why is it that the state prosecutes the bourgeois? A lot in the West can't imagine the existence of a bourgeois without them controlling the government or the state. And none of them have been to China. All right. So reading on. Again, why is it the Chinese Revolution can avoid the capitalist future without passing through a period of dictatorship, of bourgeois dictatorship? He says, the sole reason is the concrete conditions of the time. When certain necessary conditions are present, certain contradictions arise in the process of development of things, and moreover, the opposites contained in them are interdependent and become transformed into one another. Otherwise, none of this would be possible. Such is the problem of identity. What then is struggle? And what is the relation between identity and struggle? Lenin said, the unity or coincidence, identity, or equal action of opposites is conditional, temporary, transitory, relative. The struggle of mutually exclusive opposites is absolute, just as development and emotion are absolute. Absolute or universal or like always happening or whatever. And from our curriculums text, Lenin's point here is that the unity exists temporarily in any given pair of opposing sides. As the unity only exists as long as the opposing sides are opposing one another. As soon as one side eliminates or negates the other, that unity subsides. However, opposition is considered absolute, because it is opposition which drives motion and change in all things, phenomena, and ideas through contradictory processes of opposing sides. Mao says, what does this passage mean? All processes have a beginning and an end. All processes transform themselves into their opposites. The constancy of all processes is relative, but the mutability manifested in the transformation of one process into another is absolute. And mutability meaning, tendency to change. He says, there are two states of motion in all things, that of relative rest, relative, and that of conspicuous change, or visible change, easy to see. Both are caused by the struggle between the two contradictory elements contained in a thing. When the thing is in the first state of motion, it's undergoing only quantitative and not qualitative change, and consequently presents the outward appearance of being at rest. Quantitative, meaning a change in quantity of something, and qualitative, meaning a change in the quality of something or the change in the fundamental nature of a thing. When the thing is in the second state of motion, the quantitative change of the first state has already reached a culminating point and gives rise to the dissolution of the thing as an entity, and thereupon a qualitative change ensues. Hence the appearance of a conspicuous change. Let's think of a chair. You have a chair, and it's a chair, and it's there, and over time it takes a beating. The elements wear it down. Imagine the chair is outside. It's easier to imagine it getting worn down by the elements, by the rain and the wind and animals taking little bites out of it. That's a quantity change. There's a little bit less wood in it, or the rain damages it. That's a change in the quantity of the wood. You know what I mean? And it gets hit by a rock, and one of its legs fall off, or one of its legs is damaged. It's still a chair. You could sit in it. It works. It's not as great as it was before. But let's say time keeps going and going and going, and a fucking boulder hits it and it's smashed to pieces. That's a lot of quantity changing. The wood of the chair is changed a lot. There's a lot less of it that's sticking together. And really, is it a chair anymore? Can you even sit on it? It's just a whole bunch of pieces of wood laying on the ground. It's now qualitatively different. It's not a chair anymore. But it's still the same stuff. There's all that wood. It's just laying on the ground now. It's just not together. It's at a quality change. It's a basic explanation of dialectical materialism and of quantity and quality changes. Okay. So he says such unity, solidarity, combination, harmony, balance, stalemate, deadlock, rest, constancy, equilibrium, solidity, attraction. This guy pulled out the thesaurus here, etc., he says, as we see in daily life, are all the appearances of things in the state of quantitative change. Everything. Everything. On the other hand, the dissolution of unity, that is, the destruction of this solidarity, combination, harmony, balance, stalemate, deadlock, rest, constancy, equilibrium, solidity, and attraction, and the change of each other into its opposite, are all the appearances of the things in the state of qualitative change, the transformation of one process into each other. Things are constantly transforming themselves from the first into the second state of motion. The struggle of opposites goes on in both states, but the contradiction is resolved through the second state. That is why we say that the unity of opposites is conditional, temporary, and relative, while the struggle of mutually exclusive opposites is absolute. When we said above that two opposite things can coexist in a single entity and can transform themselves into each other because there is identity between them, We are speaking of conditionality. That is to say, in given conditions, two contradictory things can be united and can transform themselves into each other. But in the absence of these conditions, they cannot constitute a contradiction. They cannot coexist in the same entity and cannot transform themselves into one another. It is because the identity of opposites pertains only in given conditions that we have said identity is conditional and relative. We may add that the struggle between opposites permeates a process from beginning to end and makes one process transform itself into another, that it is ubiquitous, and that the struggle is therefore unconditional and absolute. The combination of conditional relative identity and unconditional absolute struggle constitutes the movement of opposites in all things. We Chinese often say, things that oppose each other also complement each other. First appeared in the history of who cares? That is, things opposed to each other have identity. Things opposed to each other have identity. That's if you were to memorize one thing from this section, that's what it should be. Because this was a little bit heady, right? Things opposed to each other have identity. Oh, okay, that's what that means. This saying is dialectical and contrary to metaphysics, which is a good thing, by the way. Oppose each other refers to the mutual exclusion or the struggle of two contradictory aspects. Complement each other means that in given conditions, the two contradictory aspects unite and achieve identity. Yet struggle is inherent in identity, and without struggle, there can be no identity. In identity, there is struggle. In particularity, there is universality. And in individuality, there is generality. To quote Lenin, there is an absolute in the relative. That was the very heady Section 5, Identity and Struggle of the Aspects of a Contradiction. And if you reached this far, I want you to ask yourself, do you feel like you have a better understanding of the topic at hand? The identity and struggle of the aspects of a contradiction. Again, it was a little bit sort of convoluted to explain what is sort of a basic concept. But I think that I understand it better. I hope you do too. If you got anything out of this, please feel free to support my content. It means a lot. If you're watching live, stick around for the rest of the live stream. And if you're watching the replay, check out the next section, Chapter 6, or Section 6, The Place of Antagonism